Thank you. Hello. In this beautiful afternoon, we have people online, right? So I have to use microphone. It's not that I can skip all this stuff, right? No? No? Okay. So from the program, I already saw that you had a section related to COVID. You had the section dealing also with the climate changes. And then on top of that, I will add biodiversity crisis and try to see how we can take some lessons. I'm sorry to say, mostly bad stuff, and not trying to repeat it when addressing biodiversity crisis. I mean, look at us. Masks, epidemiological protocols, instead of hugging, we are distancing. It's a really, wrong way of living, and all this new normal is annoying, but it is what it is. And it's a result of the current COVID pandemics. We are in the fourth wave, as you know. The main news, COVID, COVID, COVID. Open the media, it's COVID. Open the news channels, it's COVID. We are counting deaths, we are counting infections, we are counting vaccinated. And basically, yeah, that's what we are talking as the center of the interest. But if you go just a little bit in the very, very near history, I mean, who could imagine when we were celebrating 2020 New Year Eve? I mean, those pictures look like, right, some different planet. And nobody really thought that what has happened and all these changes that we did with our lives will happen just a few months after. The streets of many cities around the world stayed empty, and this COVID pandemic really hit us in the 2020, and it was the major news and the major topic during the last year. And when we were talking about the COVID and focusing how to deal with the new pandemics, we changed our life. We put our, we changed the way how we're living in terms, we put our life online, concerts online, teaching online, mask and everything. And we were really putting all our hopes in development of solution, in development of a vaccine, of course. The major topic, as I said, corona crisis, and the corona crisis. But at the same year, 2020, there was another important date achieved that actually went completely under the radar because we were fixed in talking just about the COVID. And this important date or important year was actually 2020 as the final year of what has been declared by the United Nations Decade on Biodiversity. Now, for those of you who are not biologists, a few basic infos that I'm sure you at least know the basics. Convention of Biological Diversity is this key umbrella convention dealing with protection, global protection of biodiversity in the world. It was established in 1992. It is also known as a Rio Convention. And then at the meeting in 2010 in Japan, in the city called Aichi, hopefully this is the right pronunciation, a party of the conventions adopted an action plan for conservation of biodiversity global action plan that contained 20 biodiversity targets that were divided into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 thematic groups. Starting with mainstreaming biodiversity, putting the biodiversity as an important subject in the global community, but also in the government policy, then reduction of direct pressures on biodiversity and promotion of sustainable use, conservation of ecosystem species, genetic diversity, conservation of ecosystem services, ecosystem resilience, and then how to enhance conservation through participatory government planning and learning and the capacity building. So the meeting was in 2010, and in order to promote all activities related to those biodiversity targets, United Nations declared the next year and then the next 10 years at the UN Decade on Biodiversity. Now, the whole story of biodiversity is it is a big thing. We also call it a biodiversity crisis due to high extinction rates that we experienced in recent years or recent decades, and the large number of species that face extinctions as the most obvious phase, but far from being the only phase of the biodiversity crisis. And this whole biodiversity crisis have a really long history. It hasn't started yesterday. Information that personally I found very interesting is that in the Roman time, ancient Rome was a big empire stretching north to Europe to complete the whole northern Africa. And the major way of having fun, games in a huge arena that were all over the huge empire. For this games, they were hunting those big lions and tigers and everything, those large carnivores in the northern Africa. So during the Roman times, those animals were already regionally extinct from northern Africa due to hunting for the games in the Roman Empire. Of course, it hasn't stopped there. The whole story about the extinctions continued with the time of the Great Exploration throughout 15th and 16th and 17th century. And there were a bunch of the species that were hunted to extinctions, not only mostly large mammals and the birds, something that we hunt for food, not only on land, also in the sea, as the stellar sea cow that was hunted to extinction in less than 30 years after it was actually first time described by European researchers from that time. It was also the time where we successfully drawn to the extinction this species, tur, which was a large herbivore that was grazing in huge herds all around Europe and Asia. So we had a herd, something like Serengeti, something that, we really don't perceive from the Europe perspective, which is now. And then, of course, those cases of the extinctions continued through the 20th century, and we stayed without different charismatic members of the megafauna. And then we went further down, and amphibians became a group, the phase group of the extinction with the high extinction rate, like golden toad, that again, it's the same story, described 20 years later, gone, okay? And then you would expect that we learned the lesson in the 20th century, and then this wouldn't happen in the 21st century. And of course, this will be, or this will be completely wrong because the extinctions continued. But it went from these vertebrates, those large animals, to other smaller species. This Madeira large white butterfly was actually the first butterfly species in Europe that went extinct. Now, when we looked at temporal dynamics of the extinction on land, well, there is a breaking point. And if you use the vertebrates, which are a good indicator group to do this, and then if you compare the background extinction rate that was before, and we know that, you can calculate it from the fossil remains, it turned out that the recent extinction rates are several folds higher that were ever in, known history of Earth. Interestingly, across different taxonomic groups, there is this breaking point. Sometime in the 19th century, and it is related to Industrial Revolution. And it was Industrial Revolution that really changed the way how we use space and how we use resources on Earth, causing many, many different changes that we see, including higher rates of the extinction. Another interesting thing, so if we'll have, or if this background extinction rate, which was calculated for mammals, and this, which is up to 2 extinctions per million species per year, okay? If this extinction rate would continue, how much time would we need to see the same number of species, vertebrates, that went extinct in the last a little bit more than 100 years? And the numbers are totally crazy. So if the extinction rates from the past will continue, for amphibians, we would need not 1 century or a little bit more than this, but this extinction will naturally happen in thousands years. So the natural extinction process, species go in, species, go out. But the rate in which this is happening is really amazing. And this is something that was first obvious, but not the only consequence of the biodiversity crisis. And all those examples are from the terrestrial ecosystems. We are land, animals, land species. What about oceans? What about seas? And 3/4 of Earth is sea, and sea is really big. And then at the beginning of the new 21st century, actually there were quite a lot of this holistic big studies trying to assess our general impact on different ecosystems, including the oceans. So this group looked, okay, what is our impact of the world oceans? And the result were like, surprise, surprise. There is hardly any place in vast oceans that are not affected by some anthropogenic driver, some anthropogenic change. And more than 40% of the oceans at that time were under medium-high to very high cumulative impact, this orange to this red. Of course, the highest impact was in areas which are near the coast, heavily populated. And then many studies also looked what is happening or what has happened in the coastal seas. Because, and what those studies actually showed, that we have a different problem in the oceans compared to what was happening on the land. While on the land, we change the surface of the land, so deforestation, building cities, as example, and we caused species extinction. It turned out that the problem in the oceans are a little bit different. So what is happening in the oceans is actually huge reduction in the abundance of animals, which means that again, some few hundred years ago, again, you can see this breaking point when the abundance, which means how many animals are there, started to drop rapidly. On the other hand, when you look what was happening with the human population, those breaking points, again, are in line in the time. And again, if you look when has that happened and how is this connected to which major event in the development of human societies, again, we will be in the time of the Industrial Revolution. So what we have in the marine systems are really not the problem of the extinctions and disappearing species, but it's a problem of huge population reductions. Interesting story is actually here, Adriatic. Where is Adriatic? It's here, right? Adriatic. Green color, Adriatic. Spoiler alert, Adriatic is the region with, or among two regions in the world, with the longest documented impact of mankind that spanned over 100 years, almost 2,000 years. So long history. Surprise, surprise. When you look where is Adriatic, at least as a coastal sea, in terms of relative abundance of the species that they looked at this study, we are at 25% what it used to be or what was considered normal. So, when I hear how the Adriatic is a beautiful sea, unique opportunity, Croatians, but I'm Croatian, by the way. Croatians, this, who can pay for this? It's so beautiful, it's so pristine, it's Mediterranean like it was. I mean, it's a total bullshit, because Adriatic is an example of heavily degraded marine ecosystem. And what we did to the coastal ecosystems, we also did to the open oceans, where you have a large populations of large predatory fishes declined for over 80, 85, 90, 95%, even worse. But it's not, again, just those large animals. If you look at marine invertebrates, a population of the live corals are decreased for between 50 and over 90%. Population of oysters or oyster reefs declined by more than 90%. I mean, those guys are not sharks and the turtles and those big charismatic stuff, but they're really important in marine ecosystems. Corals are not the animals. Corals are habitat. And the whole diversity of the whole ecosystem depends on those coral reefs. Oysters that were fished. Oysters are important, as all mollusks are important filter organisms. So they filter and naturally cleaning the water. So when you do this, you are losing filter function from the ecosystem. And the recent study that was published at the end of the last year showed that the average reduction in abundance and biomass in today's oceans are between 44, 56%. So in average, oceans are, I mean, half full or half empty, depends if you're optimist or pessimist, how would you look at it, right? So really not good. And that's the issue. That's the other story of the biodiversity crisis. It's not just the species that are disappearing, not just the habitat, but changing the abundance, right? Now, all this biodiversity stuff, why should we care and why it's important? Well, because there is some type of the ratio between the biodiversity, let's measure it as a species richness, which is number of the species, or in this case, percentage of the species in such system, and how well those ecosystems are functioning. So basically what does it mean is that as you're reducing the number of the species, reducing the biodiversity, you are at the same time, I mean, reducing ecosystem services of that system. The small problem is, those opponents of the whole biodiversity crisis issue is, okay, the species are disappearing, there is a high rate, but we really don't see that anything has changed. Well, the problem is that this relation is rarely linear. So you have a species that works in a way that you can remove one species and then another species and then another species and then another species without having a huge impact or visible or measurable impact on how the ecosystems are working, right? Until you come to some breaking point when you have huge drop, how those systems will work. On the other hand, you have other type of the species where even small changes in the species composition have major change to how those systems will work. So the story goes that as you're changing biodiversity, decrease of the biodiversity, decrease of the ecosystem functions, and then it results in the decrease of the ecosystem services that those systems are providing for us, food, water, you name it. But with a low biodiversity, those systems, those poor species systems are more sensitive to other changes. So resilience of the ecosystems is also changing. They are more susceptible to the impact of climate change, for instance, for the impact of the pollutions and everything else. And in those systems, the risks for the functioning of the whole ecosystems increases. I mean, and here we are, we are actually affecting functioning of the whole planet. Now, step back. So 2020 was the end of a decade of the biodiversity. And then at the end, Convention published a big report in how good we were in reaching those 20 goals, those biodiversity targets that we've set. Nothing. Total failure. That's how good we were. Have you ever heard this information on the TV? Newspapers somewhere? No. Totally out of a radar. Okay. So failure, global failure. And then when we fail in reaching the goal, what we people do? Huh? Okay, shut up, and then set a new goal, right? Let's set a new goal. We didn't do this, let's do it new. And this is exactly what we did in 2020. And we set a new goal, 10 more years to restore the planet. And we are now in the ecosystem decade, not the biodiversity, but it's a decade of ecosystem restoration. We are doing really good, right? So what I want to tell you is that although this corona crisis is something that we've been talking about mostly for the past 2 years, the real crisis that we have, that we are really not talking about, not near enough, is an environmental crisis. The problem with the environmental crisis is that it's much more complex. It has much longer history, and it would be much more difficult to solve it than the COVID crisis. The real crisis that we have is this one. And the environmental crisis have, again, many faces. It's not one crisis. One known and exposed part of this crisis is plastic and the pollution. So when you look at the media, when you look on the news stories, when is the Earth Day, in the best case scenario, you could hear the story about the plastics, right? And the microplastic, that's the new trend, which is a problem for sure. It feels good to deal with this for several reasons. First, it's a simple problem in terms of it's easy understandable. It's not that you have, you have to have a lot of knowledge. You all know what the plastic is, and it feels good to do something. Picking the plastics, do some action, right? We ban the plastic straws, and we are talking about the plastic. It's also for the news people. It's an easy topic. 2 reasons. First, you don't have to prepare yourself for this topic. They also know what the plastic is. And then you can really film something. You go and then you film kindergarten kids picking the plastic. Wow, here's an ecological action. But the problem is if we would if we take all plastics from the seas are still half empty or half full. Again, pessimist optimist, right? So for us working in the field of marine conservation biology, so for us working in this field, plastic, it is a problem, but it is really distracting problem. Distracting the efforts, distracting the headlights to the real problem of the biodiversity crisis. Besides plastics, another topic that has become really exposed, but just in the last year, perhaps, is a problem of climate changes. Okay. This are the average temperature on Earth since 1850s to 2010s, and as we are, going closer to the recent history, the temperature, the mean temperature are getting higher. So we also have this Paris Climate Change Accord for 140 party states. Again, we did a beautiful plan. Everything is beautiful on the paper. Hold the temperature increase at less than 2, possibly at less than 1.5. We want to reduce greenhouse gases emission for 90%, and of course, goal carbon neutrality that EU wants to reach until 2050, right? A few things. First thing is, and why we should think about it. You know, when you say this, it's always what is happening with the glaciers, with the poles, and it always seems that this is something that is kind of far away from us, except when we have the crazy weather. But it's really not, because climate change, increase of the temperature is a marine stuff. It's a marine issue. The oceans are the one driving climate. Well, we are driving by, putting carbon out, but increasing temperature are changing the temperature of the oceans, and that is where everything starts. Again, surprise, surprise. This blue is a Mediterranean. Average temperature increase in the Mediterranean is higher than the global average. And when you are in the Mediterranean, warming of the Adriatic is higher than the average of the Mediterranean. It is our thing too. And then this produce all different effects, not just on the biodiversity, but the whole production and energetic of the food web, sea level rise that and then changes in the ocean circulation. And this is already having, and will have more impact on human societies in many, many, many different ways. Extreme weather and increase of the risk is something that we are witnessing in the last few years. Now there is a problem with the climate crisis, is that we have some data from the past. And then the way how we I try to see what will happen and how the climate crisis will affect us in the future is to use climate models. And the problem with the climate models, so for instance, you have this, what is this color? Purple, okay. This purple one, no reduction of CO2, no reduction, and this is where we end. So it has some mean values, it has some minimum and the maximum, and that's something that we call a scenario, And then if you have global emission net zero in 2020, this will happen, right? So again, you have a scenarios and you have some mean values, and then you have some levels of the uncertainties, what will actually happen. And this is how the science works. The problem is when you have a certain level of uncertainty and the different possible outcomes, it can be really misused when you interpret the data. And here is the king of all misusers. You have no idea what is happening. It may happen this, it may happen this. There is uncertainty. That means that they're really not sure what they're talking about. Climate change hoax. And then the similar story. COVID crisis is a hoax, and it really doesn't exist. And as a conservationist or conservation biologist, it was really, I would say, interesting, but the better word is sad, to see development of this COVID story and how well you can relate this COVID story to the environmental crisis. So again, we don't belief. And then we were waiting for the vaccine as the solution, by the way, an easy solution to a crisis. And then something happens that we were really, or decision makers were really not expecting. The solution is here, but a small percentage of the people want to use the solution. Moreover, it ended like this. And well, except Michele, who is from Spain, and perhaps some other international students that I don't know, the rest of the team probably know what was happening in the Slovenia in the recent days. The solution, vaccination, is deadly dangerous, right? And then on the other hand, you go to Zdravnička zbornica, how would you translate this in English? Chamber, medical chamber, doctor's chamber of the Slovenia. And the official standpoint is vaccination against COVID is the most effective way to protect your health. I mean, for the heaven's sake, how we ended in this totally crazy situation. Having the science, having a solution, and then ignoring the facts. And again, it's the same story as with the climate crisis. Let's try to ignore the science. But what is behind of ignoring the science is how democracy works today. It's a story about the freedom. It's the story about the rights. It's something that, you know, everybody would call democracy. I would call it paradox of democracy. We could have a whole day lectures, you know, talking about the freedom and what freedom really means. Is there an absolute freedom? Rights, unlimitless rights. So the issue of the democracy is we should all have a voice and we all have the right, a right for opinion, which is absolutely fine. But there is another part of the story. Because when trying to deal with the issue or some problem, the important thing is, well, how will you separate irrelevant information from those who are reliable information and the facts? Because everyone can have an opinion. Opinion is nothing more than some idea that just, pops up in our mind, in our head, and that's what opinion is. But it's really far away from factual information. And there is a way, and just one and only way, how opinion becomes a fact. And the answer is science. Exactly. The way how science works, how we generate hypotheses, how we set our samples. We are talking about the replication, randomization, controls, right? Critical explanation of the results. And then the most important part of the scientific process is publishing. So how others will critically review everything that we did. And if your facts support your idea or opinion, is the time where opinion becomes a knowledge. So the problem number one is the right to the opinion, and putting the opinion in the same level as the knowledge is. And then this whole story about the knowledge and the opinion is amplified by information society that we are living in, where it's very easy to share the opinions, right? And sharing the opinions and put it in the same basket with the knowledge is why we came to where we are now. But it is not the only problem. The second problem, at least the big problem, and kind of problem that is difficult to avoid, is that at the end, we are all just humans. Humans with the right to opinion, with our beliefs, which is fine, with our background, so with our knowledge, everything, right? And then when you think about solving or way to solve biodiversity crisis or way to solve climate crisis, I mean, you're trying to do anything to solve biodiversity crisis. You're really not managing animals and the plants. You are managing humans. So you're requested to do a change in the human behavior. Solving the climate crisis, change in the human behavior again. So the whole concept of the conservation and the solution to environmental crisis is at the end about managing humans. And here is where the real problem starts, because humans, I mean, we are complex creatures. We have our value systems, and the value system is a really complex stuff. Now, in 2019, International Panel for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services of the United Nations published one interesting report analyzing the status of the ecosystem and the global status and of biodiversity and ecosystem services. Okay, and we do have this what we call direct drivers of changes, like changes in the land use or sea use or changing of the habitats and everything that we do, or direct exploitation like fishing or climate changes and everything else. First, interestingly, the set of the drivers affecting different ecosystems, the set is the same one. But behind those direct drivers, there are indirect drivers, more people and our culture, economics, technology, institution and governance, how we govern and how our institutions are set to do something, and of course, conflict epidemics. But behind indirect drivers, again, are values and behavior, which really brings the whole concept of the conservation in completely another direction. And it moves this concept from dealing with the biology to dealing with the people. And the people have opinions and the beliefs and the types of the behaviors, and everything behind that is in connection with the human values. And those guys studying and girls studying psychology here, I'm sure you know much better than we, conservation biologists, know that this whole value system is a total complex system. And there are many things that will define how you react, how you behave, what do you value, and how motivated are you to do or not to do something. And at the end, the driving forces behind the value system are really, really complex. They are working together. Cultural values, individual, social, spiritual, beliefs, attitude, perception, opinions, custom, tradition, norms, knowledge, experience, preferences, and all this and all this. So, you know, when we think why someone, and the last lecture was why someone was kind of interesting for me, you know, why Greta is doing something and why Trump is doing something else, is the issue of the interest and the value system. While why some will recycle, the other ones won't, is the issue of the value system at the end. But there is a really good thing about the value system. The value system changes. We change our value system through time, through learning, through changing the environment that we are living in. And here is where actually important solution in terms of dealing with the biodiversity and environmental crisis lays, right? So for those of you who are psychologists and not conservation, who is student of psychology here? Psychologist. So, okay, a short crash course in a conservation biology as a relatively new and fast developing scientific discipline with one mission: conservation and restoration of the biodiversity. That's what we do. And the conservation biology is actually a big, new, and multidisciplinary science that is based on biological science. It actually derives from ecology and all other biological sciences, from genetics, physiology, biogeography, you name it, right? But it's not just biological science. It takes inputs for environmental sciences, geology, environmental chemistry, climatology, everything goes here. And then we want to solve the stuff. So it's applied science. So we are also working with those working in the field of applied sciences, forestry, agriculture, fisheries. But the big breakthrough in a development of the conservation biology in the 80s, in the 1980s, were recognizing that the conservation won't work if you don't include the, you know, the real driver, and it's the people. So where interdisciplinarity of conservation biology reflects is at this interface between natural biological sciences and social sciences. And this is something the field is known as a human dimension of the conservation, right? But as the time goes on, we realize how this human dimension of the conservation is getting more and more and more important. So there is a new term that we are using, which is called conservation science, which emphasizes that we break out of just the biological sciences and including a variety of social sciences in solving the issue. From sociology, psychology, ethics, law, economics, to communication and education. All this set of different scientific disciplines is about working, identifying, and changing human values, human beliefs, and the human behavior. And here is where we fail. Here is where we failed with the COVID crisis. Because for scientists who were members of these expert panels of the government, was a normal thing of thinking, okay, we'll do the research, we will test the vaccines, we will put it out, and solution is here, the problem is done. completely ignoring the issue of human values, human beliefs, perspectives. And what we see today is that, putting everything under the same common denominator, anti-vaxxers. But the motivation behind not taking vaccines, motivations behind resisting or not following epidemiological guidelines can be really, really different. And we won't solve it. First, if we cannot identify where the problem is, and then think how, well, to change the value system, how to change beliefs, and how to change behavior. And this is why I really like this conference. And this is why I said I would gladly come here, although I'm sorry that there are no more people. I don't know how many people are on the internet or on the YouTube channel. Welcome, guys and girls. But this is really important because here we have the whole study program in biopsychology. And often when we think about the biopsychology, we are thinking about working with the people in terms of, solving the problem of diseases, kids with the problems in the behavior, whatever. It's not the only thing. There is a huge need in this field in terms of the conservation science. And what I like here is that our students were the one making really this, at least first connections. And all the story that I'm talking about the biodiversity, that was my students, they know it. It was mostly for you. Because the idea is this part of the social sciences, this part of the psychology is elemental part if we want to have successful conservation. And you can have all beautiful science. You can have all beautiful data. You can have all beautiful vaccines. But if you cannot use that in action, in changing the policies or adapting not just adapting the policies, adapting successful policies. I mean, every idiot can adapt the policy. Successful policy that is, done is what we want to hear. It won't work. So those part of the social sciences that deals with changes and understanding values and beliefs and the behavior and putting the science in successful conservation policy is a critical part of the conservation. And this is where it's a critical role of the social sciences. So, two things where environmental crisis and the COVID really are totally similar is the story about the science and putting together opinion and knowledge in the same way, and then not addressing human values and the beliefs. But there is another thing that actually kind of concerns me, that I haven't managed to find not a single article talking about it. In the field of environmental crisis, biodiversity, climate crisis, whatever. But there is a subject in public health, and which is called pandemic fatigue. There is a term. And there is a big issue with the pandemic fatigue. And there is a definition of the pandemic fatigue. And there is the whole guideline how to deal with the pandemic fatigue when we just have enough of following recommendation, and then through time, because of the differences in the emotional experiences, perception, well, we just have enough, right? We are losing motivation. And this is what leads to epidemic fatigue. There is, in terms of the COVID, protective behaviors affected by opportunity and the capability to do something, but it is also about the motivation. And the motivation, you know, have this a problematic circle which is called fatigue. And if the fatigue is higher than the motivation, then we will have a problem. In the public health, World Health Organization suggests how to deal with the problem of the fatigue from corresponding, communicating, strive for predictability and unpredictable circumstances, so thinking as well, and the other stuff. The thing is that, you know, in the recent year, as we started to live with the COVID, and now we kind of started to get out, not really, and we are trying to rebuild our jobs, is the time where individual states are putting the money in the industries that are bigger than ever before. So the principle is based upon what Churchill said, you know, never waste a good crisis. And we are actually kind of using this crisis in a good way, trying to change how we are doing our business. And there is this whole story that my speaker was mentioning before, green business and 6 climate positive action, green jobs, new way of living, end of the fossil fuel use and subsidies, and so back and so forth, right? But in order to get out of environmental crisis, in order to get out from the biodiversity crisis, I mean, it's not like COVID. We will need much longer time. And in order to do it, we will need much higher motivation. Because at the end, this will require, if you really want to do it, for each of us to partially change the way how we live, how we think, what we eat, how we travel, what we buy. Okay? So is it possible that we will have another problem that we are really not counting when talking about all these solutions? We will come to the point where we will have environmental fatigue. We will just have enough of all those changes that we are supposed to do to solve this complex environmental crisis. Okay? And then another thing, why solving this crisis should be specifically important for us, and why we should not think about the environmental crisis as something that is related to some other areas, you know, tropical areas with a huge diversity of tropical reefs, or I don't know, polar areas or whatever. Why we should care here? Well, surprise, surprise, Mediterranean region, where we sit now, it's one of 25 biodiversity hotspots. By the way, all my students know that, right? So it's an area important for global biodiversity, but what is concerning is that a recent study that was published at the end of 2020 showed an interesting result. And this is that, well, tropical and Mediterranean biodiversity is disproportionately more sensitive to land use and to climate changes than other areas. So the thing is that in this Mediterranean area where we are, and the reason why we have this big biodiversity is, of course, the whole evolutionary history of the area. And it is really affected by the fact that many species have border of the ranges in this area, which means here you will find some species that are normally distributed more on north, but also the species that are more distributed on the south. And those are the overlap of ranges for small mammals in Europe. And then on top of that, during the glaciation periods, that was the runaway hideaway place for many, many species. And their intensive speciation was happening here. So we do have a high biodiversity here. And then when the climate will change, the ranges will move, affecting the biodiversity. And what this study actually showed, surprise, surprise, that in terms of the impact of the climate change, changes of species richness per degree of centigrade of change will be the highest in tropical forests, tropical grasslands, and in Mediterranean. So it is our fate. What shall we do? This is a classical question, right? What can we do as individuals? What can we do as the society, as individual? I would say taking a career in conservation science, no matter if you are conservation biologists or working on social sciences. I mean, it's a good way to do something, right? And especially because we have a lack, so not enough, of trained and specialized social scientists working in the field of conservation science. So that's the one way. But the other thing is, I mean, we can't all be Greta. And this Greta phenomena is also interesting phenomenon. For me, it's amazing that, you know, people listen more to Greta than to dozens and dozens of climate scientists that really know what they're talking about, not just a kid who have some facts. And that this message was not going out, and that the message of Greta goes out much more loud, reaching more people than of the scientists who are telling the same thing for years. So, I mean, what to do? We can change our individual behaviors in a certain ways, in a certain amount, thinking what we buy, you know, plastic recycling, cars, emissions, blah, 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 okay? Which is good, you know, because when one person change, how do you call, žarnica, bulb, it really doesn't mean anything, but when you have millions of billions people do it, then it makes a difference, right? So this is how the individual involvement looks like. But the thing is, this won't be enough. And what this failure in addressing biodiversity crisis in the decade of the biodiversity should teach us is that we have to think, who are we voting for? Or the most important thing is to set different policies. And the people who are setting different policies are politicians. Again, good example also come from the United States. We're changing the president. I mean, really change the direction of the whole environmental policy of the United States. Different policy. So what I'm kind of preaching to young generation is being apolitical is really not an option, because the highest or the biggest impact that you can have is supporting the policies that correspond to your values and to your views. If this is about working in the field of conservation, solving or finding a better direction, new direction, different direction to deal with the biodiversity and environmental crisis, the take-home message is think, how will you select those policies? You cannot be apolitical in the world that we are living. And this is the way how will you actually make the biggest impact. Because the earth is still and will be still the best place that we have. It is our home. Thank you.